Thanks, Tyler. Things are about to take a slightly more academic turn. I'm a grad student. This is going to sound like a grad student talk, but I've endeavoured to make it less technical than it might otherwise have been. Among the more vivid vignettes in Len Lye's career was the alarmingly hostile reception of his film A Colour Box at the 1936 Venice Film Festival. Screened before an audience that had likely been seeded with Nazi sympathisers, his 3-minute masterpiece was the subject of such rousing condemnation that it couldn't be shown in its entirety. There are several reasons why Hitler's National Socialists would have objected to a work such as Lye's, none of which are entirely surprising. His film was purely abstract and thus degenerate in Nazi eyes. It made use of a jazz soundtrack and was thus further tainted by the stigma of negroid cultural associations. And its purpose was to impart a feeling of enhanced somatic liveliness and well-being to its viewers, via a process Lye referred to as direct bodily empathy. It's this dimension of Lye's early filmmaking practice that I want to talk about today. From his teenage years onward, Lye had sought to make artworks capable of transmitting feelings of received movement and energy to their spectators, in ways that would not only be enjoyable, but would help promote a more somatically fulfilling way of being in the world. And while he never conceived of this project as an explicitly political undertaking, it is not difficult to see why it would have enraged the sensibilities of Nazi cultural overseers. For at the heart of several focal sectors of Nazi art production lay a stern and deadening ethos of corporeal discipline, regimentation, desensitisation, and alienation, whose purpose was to militarise and corporatise the German body politic. This ethos is exemplified most memorably in the films of Leni Riefenstahl with their massed assemblages of German citizens and soldiers. And I'm showing you here a still from Riefenstahl's film Triumph of the Will, and the work of Hitler's favourite sculptor Arno Breker, who specialised in producing figures with impossibly rigid armour-like physiques. Little wonder then that whether they knew of the specifics of Lye's views on cinema or did not, the National Socialists at Venice should have been so hostile to A Colour Box, whose somatic agenda was diametrically at odds with their own. I'm interested in the reception of Lye's film at Venice for what it tells us about the social and political stakes of his work as an avant-garde filmmaker in the pre-World War II period, which in my view pass far beyond the issue of fascist attitudes toward modernism in the human body. Normally, when Lye's work of this period is discussed by historians of art and cinema, it is located within two overlapping narrative contexts: that of absolute or abstract cinema, which branched off from abstract painting in the 1910s. And here's an example here, a film by Hans Richter called Rhythmus. And that of visual music, a diverse field of artistic practices from the interwar period that traded on perceived equivalences between musical and visual form, as in the work of Oskar Fischinger. Yet while both of these historicising gestures are entirely valid, they do little to ground Lye's work in the social context of its time, thereby confining his practice to a putatively autonomous realm of artistic production. Because no art is truly autonomous, however, I'm interested in moving Lye's early film work beyond these narrative contexts, to consider its standing within the broad network of social forces that govern bodily experience in the interwar period. This was an era in which efforts on the part of business and government to rationalise and standardise all aspects of social experience in the name of modernity and progress intensified enormously, in ways that tended to constrain and regulate bodily experience in a variety of ways. To take just one example of this creeping rationalisation of somatic activity, we need look no further than the well-documented phenomenon known as the Taylorization of the workplace. Frederick Winslow Taylor was a US efficiency expert who whose meticulous analyses of workplace functions were intended to enable workers to perform their jobs as smoothly as possible, saving labour and raising productivity. The problem was, however, that the highly prescriptive methods for performing tasks that his analyses tended to promote were also highly regimenting, resulting in work processes that were routine and mechanical to the extreme. It was this phenomenon that Charlie Chaplin lampooned in his 1936 film Modern Times, and some of you will recall the rather hilarious conveyor-belt scenes in that movie. Now, I don't think that Lye made his films with the intention of fighting the rationalisation of labour, and I don't think his works were ever directed explicitly against the fascist regimentation of the body. I'm simply interested in understanding where Lye's output stands in relation to these sorts of somatically alienating practices. For in hindsight, it's clear that in an interwar social field whose prevailing drift was toward a growing rationalisation and thus standardisation of social and somatic life, Lye's films were notable for their far more welcoming view of bodily experience. And it is as such that I wish to see them recognised and remembered today. Lye was an avant-garde artist, and one key function of avant-garde art in the interwar period was to imagine and promote new ways of living in the world, proceeding from the starting point of dream worlds first imagined in the space of art. From the futurist advocacy of all things mechanical and rapid fire, such as in this Boccioni painting, to the Soviet constructivist attempts to fashion objects that would aid in the construction of a worker's paradise to come. And I'm showing you here some sports uniform designs by, I want to say Popova, it's not Popova, Barbara Stepanova. One role of avant-garde artists at this time was to model and seek to implement forward-looking visions of reality. In an essay I recently completed, I addressed the ways in which Lye sought to model and promote a more somatically attentive and thus less alienated approach to such key domains of modern life as leisure, labour, infrastructural rationalisation and war. And what I'd like to do here is give you just the briefest summary of how this process unfolded, concentrating on Lye's efforts to imagine and actualise new dream worlds of leisure and labour in three of his films from the 1930s, A Colour Box from 1935, Rainbow Dance from 1936, and Trade Tattoo from 1937. A Colour Box is Lye's first surviving direct film. As is well known, it was produced without the use of a camera, its imagery having been painted and scratched entirely by hand. The result was a 3-minute sequence consisting for the most part of quivering fields of dots, eccentrically pinwheeling triangles and trembling vertical lines, all jumping to the jaunty rhythms of Creole jazz soundtrack. Lye's aspiration in this work was simple. He wished to transfer the ecstatic energies of sound, colour and movement in his film to the bodies of its viewers, recalling their attentions to the simple and rejuvenating pleasures of physical embodiment. More than just a feast for the outwardly directed senses of sight and vision, A Colour Box, like all of Lye's direct films, was addressed in the first instance to the interoceptive senses of its spectators, modes of sensation like proprioception and kinesthesis that feel as if they're being triggered from inside our bodies rather than from outside. What's interesting about this interoceptive way of approaching cinema is that it works against the sedentary and somatically pacifying character of many cinematic experiences by making us feel like we want to dance in our seats. Conventional narrative cinema of the 1930s did not, in the main, like to remind its viewers of their embodiment, and if it did, this was seldom a priority. We can therefore think of A Colour Box as having wished to contravene this state of affairs by advocating a more physically engaged and enlivened form of cinematic spectatorship, unencumbered by the cognitive distractions of narrative. In Rainbow Dance, Lye took his advocacy of this somatically heightened mode of spectatorship out into the wider world, to suggest how the simple experience of physically interacting with one's environment could provide a welcome means of escape from the routinized demands of one's job and everyday existence. The film, which was produced using a then new form of colour processing called gas bar colour, loosely chronicles the life and times of a London-dwelling man who leaves the drab confines of the city for a country vacation. Having reached his destination, he walks and dances in the hills, allowing the energies of the natural environment to pervade and animate his body. Thereafter, he engages in an artfully stylised game of tennis with a medley of painted balls that spin and whirl around him. As the film unfolds, the sonorous and somatic forces of music and pure colour are repeatedly transposed from the exterior to the interior of his body and back again, in a free play of counterpointed exchange between his body and its surroundings. The result is a vividly conjured dream world of unalienated bodily sensation, in which an emphatically kinesthetic dimension is brought to all modes of leisure activity. Theoretically speaking, Rainbow Dance was an advertisement for British Parcel Post, but so captivating and immediate is Lye's imagery that the stiffly worded voiceover from the film's sponsor, with which the film concludes, feels like nothing so much as a suffocating recall to the darkly silhouetted realm of featureless streets and houses with which the film opens, in which the bodily vitality of Lye's protagonist will once more be sapped away by the deadening demands of everyday routine. In Trade Tattoo from 1937, another postal commission, Lye's brief was to demonstrate the centrality of the mail system to the social and economic welfare of an increasingly rationalised British society, both at home and across the full reach of its world-spanning trade networks. His own preference, however, was to treat the film as a forum for suggesting how the rhythms of this far-flung infrastructure could be reconciled with the pleasures of unalienated bodily sensation instead of working to constrain them. Trade Tattoo is a film comprised partly of hand-painted and stenciled imagery and partly of found lengths of photographic footage. In the film's purely photographic sequences, Lye refrains from figuring a vision of society in which the creeping forces of mechanisation, taylorisation, and industrial standardisation have encroached excessively on the somatic sovereignty of workers, and instead presents scenarios in which a more balanced exchange of energy between machine and body prevails. From start to finish, workers are shown in at best lightly industrialised settings, directing the movements of cranes and ropes with ease, instead of having the rhythms of automated machinery forcibly imposed upon them. When footage of a mailroom appears, Lye focuses not on sedentary and repetitive desk-bound activities, but instead hones in on the deft and dexterous hand movements of bustling clerks and secretaries. And when at several points crisscrossing strands of cargo-bearing workers file past the camera's eye, they do so unhurriedly and are only loosely regimented in their activities. Elsewhere, when Lye brings found footage and handmade imagery together, he allows the jaunty rhythms of stenciled and hand-painted imagery to mitigate the severe and unforgiving rhythms of industrial modernity, unsettling them with strange and joyous plays of feeling and movement at every turn. Because this imagery serves as both trigger and stand-in for the wild and sometimes anarchic impulses of the human body, we could say that in Lye's dream world of labour, the body is never so tightly disciplined that its singular and lively urges cannot break free from the tightly regimented cycles and routines that industry and infrastructure demand. Which brings me to my conclusion. In the mid-1930s, when these three films were made, Lye was not making films with any explicit social aim in mind. He was merely hoping to share his enthusiasm for embodied experience. Yet by virtue of the social circumstances in which he found himself, whose somatic prerogatives were so often at odds with his own, his dream worlds of leisure and labour today strike us as potent and inspiring imaginings of a more joyous and uplifting society.